Okay, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harald Oberhofer, and I'm the coordinator of the FIW project here in Vienna. And it's a great honor for me to host this first ever FIW Trade Talk, which is a new event series in which we want to discuss current trade policy topics periodically. So stay tuned, more to come. But I'm very happy to kick this off today with a topic, I think, which is, I cannot imagine to be more timely as the one we want to discuss today. Before starting, I want to thank the Austrian Federal Ministry for Digital and Economic Affairs, not only for supporting this project for so long, but now also for generous financial support that makes this new event series possible. So the topic of today is Brexit and the future of EU-UK trade relations. As I've said, I think it's nothing that is more timely as this one. So we have a new trade agreement, which is in force since 2 weeks, actually. And also today, we released a new study on the potential trade and welfare effects from this new trade agreement. So it's a perfect match that we can discuss this topic now with a guest. I also would say I cannot imagine a more distinguished one to have for discussing Brexit and trade policy in general as David Henig. So David, I want to welcome you to this FIW Trade Talk. It's my great honor to host you today. I just want to briefly introduce you to the audience and then hand over to you. So David works at the European Center for International Political Economy, and there he is director of the UK Trade Policy Project, and he also co-founded the UK Trade Forum, which is a forum or a platform that brings together trade policy experts from the whole UK in order to discuss all relevant and new trade policy aspects. David was also heavily engaged in TTIP negotiations. We just previously talked a little bit about the potential about reviving TTIP negotiations on one of the two sides, EU or UK with the US. I think that will be also a topic for today later on. And also David helped to establish the new Department for International Trade, which has to be established after the Brexit referendum in the United Kingdom in 2016. The structure for today would be as following. David will give an input of about 50 minutes on the topic Brexit and the future of EU-UK trade relations. And then we're going to have a discussion. So we're going to discuss open questions. In case you want to participate and if you have questions, I would ask you to put your questions into the chat of this session, and then I will integrate these questions into our discussion afterwards. And just a final organizational remark, at the end of the session, when you leave the room, you will be directed to a questionnaire which delivers feedback questions for the seminar series, for this Trade Talk series. And I would be very happy if you could just take a few minutes and reply to this question. Thank you very much in advance. And with this, I would like to hand over to David. David, thank you very much for being with us today, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion.
Thank you, and guten Tag. No, nobody told me I would be measured, that I would get feedback. Marks out of 10. So we will try our best to satisfy that. Thank you once again for the invite. I'm just going to need to adjust my screen slightly to hope you can. Sorry, I just need to adjust slightly to get my. There we go. Right. Hope so. All right. There we go. Right. So thank you for this invite. We have a new trade agreement as of agreed 3 weeks ago, and it's quite remarkable, really, that a trade agreement agreed 3 weeks ago, implemented 2 weeks ago. We've really barely had time to understand fully what this is about. Still less to read it. I'm probably one of the few people. I have a hard copy. This is only volume 1 of it. There's a second volume as well. So sitting above my desk, I do now sometimes have to reference this. And what I wanted to do in this talk was to look at that agreement and look at future UK-EU trade in the context of what I call modern trade relations. The trade relationship between the UK and the EU, obviously, as we were full members of the EU, is an enormously deep and complex one. £670 billion worth of trade per year in goods and services. At least that is on UK figures. On EU figures, actually even higher. Unfortunately, the EU's published some slides on the agreement 2 days ago, and they have very different trade figures to those of the UK. So this is the problem we are going to have to work out. But anyway, I want to look at modern trade relations, where the UK-EU relationship and the new agreement fits in, what that means for the future, and what that means indeed for broader questions of EU and UK trade going forward. Well, apologies for using slides, because I never normally like to use slides, but there's a lot going on here, and I wanted, just for the clarity, I felt it important to reflect some of that. Just about those subjects. Now, just a little bit more about me. As well as looking at UK trade policy, I look at global issues as well. So one of the areas I'm looking at the moment, and have a series to be published fairly soon, is on the new global trade, on how we understand global trade today, on the nature of global value chains, upon which up to 80% of our trade may be part of, how we understand trade in services. And I've been drawing on some of that material in these slides as well. As well as there are other issues we're thinking about in trade, such as climate change and animal welfare. So I don't just do UK-EU relations, for which I'm very grateful. The other thing to note is that between 2009 and 2018, I worked for the UK government successively on US-China relations. I started in 2010. Then I moved on to TTIP, Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, in 2013. And then I moved on to Brexit in 2016. These being 3 rather large issues. So to be honest, I'm wondering what's next, and whether it will be quite as intense as I've had before. But I'm also writing about international trade in a number of publications, but including I've got a new column starting in the trade magazine Borderlex, the online trade news service. So let's look then at modern trade relations. Oops, I've gone on too far. And at the bottom here, I want to start by thinking about these pictures. What we've seen in modern trade is an enormous rise in trade dating to around 1990. If we look at the picture at the bottom right, between 1990 and 2008, approximately, we have a significant rise in global trade. We then have a bump for the global financial crisis, and in terms of goods trade, we've never quite recovered. In terms of services trade, that continues to rise. The dotted line, incidentally, is GDP, just to show global GDP going up at the same time. But trade is a far higher number than we've ever seen before, and that was to do with essentially moving from one model of trade, which was the idea essentially that you made something entirely in one country and sold it to another, to a modern situation where we combine goods and services from different countries into new packages of goods or services and sell them in turn onto others. And this is run essentially by the large companies in supply chains. And this is a very different world of trade from that we were used to before. It's also reflected in UK trade figures. That's the last 20 years on the bottom left. The UK trade figures have been going up as per the global trade figures. one of the things that's quite interesting in the small, in the detail of that, is that that's true except for goods trade between the UK and the EU. Goods trade between the UK and the EU has basically not risen since 2017. And that has to be a Brexit effect. So we are already seeing the Brexit effect, and that is the yellow and the lighter blue lines on the bottom left picture. And we, in terms of regions of trade, which is the middle picture, is that in 1983, it was Europe contributed nearly half of this is goods exports by region. Now Europe and Asia are close together. North America's shrunk slightly, and the rest of the world has shrunk slightly. So Europe is still, what we're saying here, is still a huge global player and a region, a hub of supply chains in its own right. And that obviously is very significant for the UK putting up new barriers to trade. Now, what we have is a network of trade, a network of relationships between goods and services suppliers, very complex and not particularly well understood, and all in some way regulated, whether by products and services subject to regulation or general societal regulations of the level playing field type that were such big discussions in UK-EU trade talks. So that is the context, a context of increasingly complex, but also significantly increasing trade. And that is also brought forth by trade liberalization since 1990. We had the single market coming into operation in 1992, the creation of the WTO in 1995, China joining the WTO, and we've seen the results of that. So what happens when we put in trade barriers? And that, of course, is the Brexit story. Now, this is an attempt to summarize some of the main elements of the UK-EU deal. Clearly, in 1,250 pages, there's a lot of it. And it's not just about this deal. So you have the trade and cooperation agreement agreed on December 24, but you have the withdrawal agreement from 2019, which came into force in January 2020, which, for example, covers geographical indications, the Northern Ireland Protocol. So not everything is in the new trade and cooperation agreement. But what we find in the trade and cooperation agreement is that, with the exception really of tariffs on goods, which are eliminated, we find that much else that would support a modern trade relationship, that complex network of interrelationships, is not there. We don't, for example, have accumulation of rules of origin, of the rules for claiming the preferential tariffs. The UK wanted something based around perhaps the EU-Japan agreement. The EU already has a regional scheme, the PEM, the Pan-European Mediterranean Convention on Rules of Origin, but neither appear in this trade deal. There is only limited easing of regulatory checks, which is why those following the UK story this week, why there are such problems over food and drink exports from the UK, because there is in fact no equivalence agreement to reduce checks on UK products going to the EU. So there are more checks on UK food going to the EU than there are, for example, for New Zealand food coming to the EU. Only minor easing of checks in industrial products. In services, there's very little beyond, there's a standard trade agreement, but that doesn't cover very much. We have no mutual recognition of professional qualifications. Data equivalence is there as a temporary holding measure until the EU can cover this more and consider whether the UK should have a data adequacy arrangement or not, or sorry, should be considered adequate for transfer of data. Financial services equivalence is not there until the two parties agree a new memorandum of understanding in March. There are barriers to the movement of people for work. The UK withdraws from European regulatory agencies. That's the UK's choice. Very little regulatory cooperation then. And all of that So there's so many areas there that could be in a modern trade agreement, but this is not untypical of free trade agreements. They are not normally well designed to cover the thickness of modern trade relations. And all of that accompanied by what I think are the strictest rules ever seen in a trade agreement on labour and the environment, the non-regression clauses, the divergence clauses, potential penalties for future denial of access to UK fishing waters. So this is an agreement which only really covers a certain element of the rules you really want for a modern, in a modern trade relationship like the UK and the EU have, and in a high volume trade relationship. And that, it seems to me, must have an impact on trade flows. There will be some trade that is not particularly well covered by trade agreements, can continue as it is. For example, our call is taking place across borders and is perfectly legal, I hope. But this will have an effect on goods we are seeing immediately, and it will have an effect on services once people start to travel again after COVID restrictions are lifted. There are one or two other areas in the agreement that are helpful, such as on haulage and aviation, but significantly, the summary there covers the main issues. So let me look at what the next steps and the adjustments might be. And I'm dividing this into the economics and the politics. On the economics, I've now here put together some numbers. These are the UK numbers on what's happening with UK trade, divided into EU goods, rest of the world goods, EU services, the rest of the world services. And what we can see is, as I mentioned earlier, that trade between the EU and the UK in goods has been flat since 2017, but has continued to, UK trade with the rest of the world has continued to rise. So what happens there? Does UK-EU services trade now stop rising as well? Well, clearly there will be a COVID effect anyway for 2020 figures and 2021. But I would expect that, yes, UK-EU services shows a flat trend from here on in terms of numbers. And I suspect that EU-UK goods trade is going to decline in the next 2 years. So I don't see how the UK can stay a part of European chains of production, for example, in the automotive sector. The UK will still contribute in some ways and in some areas, but it seems unlikely that there will be so much trade in components between the UK and the EU, in which case we'll see a decline. I think there's a more interesting question for me is what we will see between the UK and the rest of the world. Clearly, the supporters of Brexit always felt that there would be more trade. We would make up for lost EU trade in the rest of the world. But I think there is at least an arguable case that it will be the opposite. That because the UK is no longer part of the European supply chains that are in turn, in some ways, integrated into the rest of the world, that we will also find our exports to the rest of and imports from the rest of the world going down. We will probably import and export a little bit more food from to and from the rest of the world, substitution from the EU. But I think in industrial products we will also see potentially a decline in UK trade performance. We may see a better performance in UK services, which will be subject to trade barriers. The UK is historically highly competitive in many services, and the trade barriers in these areas are less clear. The fact that they're not included in the trade deal is not, we wait to see how that actually affects real trade numbers. Financial services, for example, there could well be a lot of action of subsidiaries being set up. But some UK services exports, I don't know, Premier League football, for example, aren't necessarily going to be affected and are actually quite valuable. So we wait to see exactly what the numbers will have, but I think that trade to be flat or falling for a period is quite likely for the UK. Now, how does that then in turn feed into the politics? And we have some issues in the UK with regard to Northern Ireland and Scotland. The Irish Protocol means that Northern Ireland for goods trade is more aligned with the EU than with the UK. And a lot of conversations are starting in Northern Ireland and in Ireland about future prospects for a single Ireland. Whether that will happen soon, I can't say, but certainly that is the trend. And in Scotland, there is now a consistent majority in opinion polls for an independent Scotland, and that is primarily made up of the under 50s, which means this is also a growing segment. So there is a possibility that Scotland would choose to leave the UK and rejoin the EU if they were eligible. And these add up to the pressure on the UK government. So what we see is that the more the UK government chooses to diverge, the greater the economic cost. If the UK government chooses to diverge on labour and the environment, that's through the level playing field provisions. But more directly, if the UK chooses to diverge on food and drink or industrial regulations, then there will be more checks on UK goods exports, and potentially there will be less UK exports. So the business pressure will be on the government not to diverge, but there is a desire for what would be known as the Brexit dividend in the UK to diverge and find new areas of growth. That will be a tricky one for the UK government. Now, politically, there's no great difference between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. No party is currently saying that we want a different relationship with the EU. That is likely to be stable at least for a few years, but it could well change in the future as we become more aware of the barriers to trade that have come in. We have to remember this is a shock. We haven't seen barriers to trade between the UK and the EU for 30 years. People were talking in the abstract before. Now they are seeing what it means, and they may not be impressed. So we may see some response to that, some reaction. The UK government will also be committed to trade deals with the US and to joining the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, potentially taking the UK away from the EU rules and regulations set. But again, that has a potential economic cost to the UK. So things that before were maybe abstract are now real to the UK government, and decisions have potentially direct economic consequences. So the politics are still to be worked out of that. And when we look at the politics still to be worked out, we then think about the big picture issues on which I'm going to finish, both in the UK and in the EU. I believe that European supply chains are weakened with EU-UK barriers. Fragmentation of the services market, for example, fragmentation of the financial services market is likely to lead to a loss of EU competitiveness overall. We're going to be talking a lot in the coming weeks about a potential reset between the EU and the US with the election of President Biden, with the Biden administration. But there's a long-running list of problems between the EU and the US on areas like data or food standards. And the UK is generally going to be on the side of the US rather than the EU on this. That could potentially have an impact on the ability of the EU and the US to come together and to resolve differences. I think it's quite interesting. The climate change and labour provisions could become the new EU precedent for trade agreements, but where does that leave the EU-Mercosur agreement? Or, given that the UK, the EU and the US now are all in theory committed to climate change measures, could we set a more positive precedent and work together on those? How in fact will both the UK and the EU think about regulatory divergences in the future. I'm talking in big terms about the UK's decision on divergence or staying with EU regulations, but also to what extent will the EU want the UK to stay within the rule set? What is the type of UK relationship that the EU wants? I think that is a big question as well. I noticed competition between the UK and the EU already breaking out. We notice it in two areas. I notice it in vaccine rollout and trade sanctions on both China and Belarus. Now, to what extent is in fact the presence of a UK outside of the EU an incentive to both sides to now have a country to compare against? So if the UK wants to be more nimble with regulation, will that spur the EU to doing the same thing? Will the UK be able to in fact escape the regulatory gravity of the EU? And then the ability of the UK and the EU to work together at the WTO, where there are many issues still to be resolved. Can the UK and the EU work together on global economic issues? I think that is still to be tested as well. So we're only 2 weeks into the new trade relationship. I think that's far too early to be drawing any great conclusions. But what I think we can see right now is there's a lot of questions. We see teething troubles now, but this is the start of an economic adjustment in the UK. It's the start of trying to find a new relationship with the EU. I don't think we're in anything like a stable position. Really, I think there is a lot up for grabs in the future relationship. And with that, I'll end the presentation and hand back to Harry.
Sorry, I need to unmute. Thank you very much, David. Very interesting thoughts, and I think a very great starting point for further discussions. So maybe I want to start with the first, not really directly economic question, since this Brexit process took so long. My impression is that on the European Union side and the population, citizens of the European Union, people are now rather happy that this is over and that we settled somehow, and the biggest damage has been able to be reduced by having a trade agreement. So I would be interested, since we typically are used to just see our own position, how do people in the UK feel about the deal now, the new trade agreement, the overall outcome of Brexit?
No, initially, I think it's the same. I think that probably people in the EU got bored quicker than we did. But I think that one of the reasons that the UK government was able to come to a deal without really achieving some of our major goals was because people had got bored of this. I mean, we find trade agreements fascinating, but most of the normal population don't. And I think this was getting boring. They just wanted to get on with it. Now, of course, you start to see the impacts of it. So we moved, January the 1st is a change. We moved from Brexit as a theory about which we had got bored to Brexit as a reality on which we see change. And it is too early to say how that is affecting people, but there is no sign that, for example, the country is now more united over Brexit. There is still a high percentage, around 50%, who think that Brexit was a mistake, and that was before we see any impact. So yes, we were bored, but now very quickly we move into a new phase. But certainly not yet. We're not yet seeing Brexit back on the headlines and front pages, and I think that nobody really wants to have that level of Brexit dominating the news as it has really for 3 or 4 years.
Thanks. Maybe just to follow up on this, it's more like a personal interest, because I'm not sure about this. Do you think that there has ever been a real chance that they would not agree to a deal? So do you think there has really been any point in time where a no-deal Brexit scenario has been realistic, given the economic costs that would cost?
Well, I don't think that economics was ever very high on the list of the UK government. And the UK government had obviously talked tough throughout this period of saying, of course we would walk away.
Yeah.
Now, when it comes down to it, it did not. So I think that rather than saying, was it ever a prospect? I think the question in my mind would be, what was it that ensured that there was a deal? And it seems to have been, from where I look at it, the prospect that of tariffs, and particularly that this would harm the UK car industry, and Nissan, which is a particularly kind of celebrated part of the car industry. Now, if that's the case, that the economics have in the end trumped the politics, then that tells us something very interesting about the UK government, which is that ultimately it will do the deal if threatened enough by the economics. But that has not been what they have said. So there is this disconnect in the UK between what the UK government has said and the way it acted in the end. And another pointer to that is that on fish, which was supposed to be a UK priority, we really did not get the result we were hoping for in fish, but we still did the deal. So no, the economic cost was not said to be important, but yes, it was important enough to make sure that we got a deal. So draw a conclusion from that. It's not about the economics, but the economics is certainly there.
Very interesting. Thanks a lot. Maybe just directly continuing with the economics. So in Europe, we now received this news over the last couple of days that seems to be a serious threat of food shortage, especially in Northern Ireland. What is your view on this? Is this overtold story in Europe, or do you really see a big issue with especially agricultural food products right now?
No, I don't think there is a realistic prospect of shortages, because I think that in Northern Ireland, I mean, we remember that Northern Ireland, there is no border to the Republic of Ireland. And I think that some of this is just poor preparation and last minute agreements by some retailers. So the reason I say that is that Lidl, which obviously is a cross-European retailer, has pictures today saying we have full stocks in Northern Ireland. We were totally prepared for this. So it looks more likely to be a problem with individual retailers not realizing that the need to configure their supply chains. And I think that this is a point I would like to expand on. So there is a short-term impact of the new trade barriers, and then there is going to be a longer-term impact. So the short term is that some retailers, for example, but also some industrial goods producers, will find there are problems. There are problems filling in the forms. DB Schenker have stopped for the time being sending goods into the UK. New forms, we're not completely ready for them. Some trade has stopped. Some food and drink, we have problems going between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The right forms haven't been filled in. There might be a shortage of vets. Now, all of this can be fixed. The paperwork can be resolved, but it will all come at a cost. So the first wave of difficulty will pass once the extra costs are paid, once the systems have got up and running. But then we come on to the longer term adjustment. And if we're looking at Northern Ireland, it is far easier for supermarkets in Northern Ireland to be supplied with food from the Republic of Ireland in the future than from Great Britain. Similarly, we will find that some industrial producers in Great Britain, it's no longer worth their while to trade with the EU. In fact, we've already seen that to a degree. Some of these retailers have the UK as a European hub. That is no longer a practical way to do business under this trade agreement. This is my point about the trade agreement not supporting modern trade. And this is where we will see an economic adjustment, primarily in the UK. There'll clearly be a little bit in Europe. We will see this economic adjustment, and yeah, activity will move. That will take some time now. So I think that the food shortages, I think, can be overcome, and I don't think it is a huge problem right now, though there are concerns that the system is not quite working as it should. But there are bigger long-term implications. So yes, look at the immediate issues, but also look at the longer-term economic structure.
Yeah, thank you. I would totally agree on that. We need to look at short-run issues and the medium-run adjustments. The short-run costs certainly come with the fact that when you negotiate a trade deal until 1 week before it has to be enforced, that adjustments will maybe be too late for some of the business to be well prepared, especially over the Christmas break and so on and so forth. So I would agree on this. And as far as I see it, it's also that it's not only just Brexit that happened, but you also had this close of borders due to the COVID issue with Britain, which might also, of course, induce some short-run problems here, especially for maybe food delivery, or then I don't know, but that is also something that happened in parallel, right? So I also think we need to wait here and see how this evolves over time. But maybe coming to the adjustment costs a little bit more, because that's actually what Brexit will be about, or the new trade deal will be about, at the medium-term adjustments. As you have already said, that's in my point of view also a very interesting point, that the deal is not very deep when it comes to services trade, right? And to liberalization of the services industry. And a lot of discussion, especially from the Remain side of Brexit, always has been, well, that could be very harmful for the City of London, and especially the financial service providers being located in London. Interestingly, in our study that we prepared, it seems to be, and that would be in line with what you already said, that it might be the case that the UK's financial service industry could be better off without being in the European Union as a result of Brexit and this new trade deal. So what is your view, especially on, because in Europe we have this, well, yeah, City of London and financial providers, and that's basically, you have the old manufacturing goods and then the service providers, and that's what you trade with the UK, and that's all. So we always put a lot of public interest in this sector. What is your view on
Okay, right. This may take a few moments to explain, because I think there are a number of things we need to take into account in the sort of patterns of modern trade and in the way the EU wants to respond. The first one is there is definitely a clustering effect in modern trade, whereby certain countries or regions become centers of excellence in certain provision, whether goods or services. And there is no doubt that London is a center of expertise for financial services, not just with the financial services themselves, but with financial technology, the fintech, with the legal and the marketing and the many other services around it. London is a global city for financial services along the lines of, let's just say, Hong Kong or New York. And so that would be number one. Now, number two is that the EU does not want London as an offshore financial risk, which it is. So the EU does not want to do that. But at the same time, there is no sign that the EU can build a similar center of excellence, or that one will emerge independently. Therefore, in my sense of the way that modern trade works is that there will be greater provision in the EU, and some activities will clearly move into the EU, but many will do so on a kind of subsidiary or affiliated basis to London companies. So the hub will still remain in London, even when activities are carried out in the EU and under EU regulation and supervision, but still somehow with a London element to them as well. Now, that's not certain. This is all a little bit speculative, but because London has that power, you would think that London could still be competitive, more so than any European city. With some losses, it won't be the same, but it could comparatively still be strong. So that would be my argument as to why the City of London could still be a strong provider of EU financial services. but I don't think we know for certain. And I think this brings us to the experimental nature of what is happening here, that in 30 years of those trade numbers growing that I showed right at the start, that has been on the basis of trade liberalization or standstill on trade rules. That what no country has done in any serious way is to raise trade barriers. The US clearly has done so with regard to tariffs, and particularly with China in the last 4 years. But even that is only one small part of trade. What the UK has done is raise trade barriers on goods, services, regulations at the same time, or simultaneously on one day. Nobody has done this before with the nature of modern trade and with global supply chains. So we are in an experiment to see what happens. And my instinct is that centres of excellence like London are better able to weather such trade barriers than areas where London has no where the UK has no significant competitive advantage over Europe. And I'm afraid that might include, for example, the car industry or general manufacturing, where there is no reason why parts for European supply chains should continue to be made in the UK.
Okay, thank you. But just on the last point, I think that's a very interesting one. If you say so, you have some industries that are globally very competitive, would agree on that, and you have some that might not be very useful or competitive. That would somehow imply that Brexit might speed up the pressure from structural change and increase inequality over the country, right? Is that what you would expect? And isn't it that those regions that voted most in favor of Brexit would then maybe be hurt the most?
And that is a political problem. So this is exactly the case. I mean, let's be honest here. This is not just the UK that has this issue. We know that the US has this issue as well, and I think other countries do as well, of areas that had once been manufacturing, which there will not be significant manufacturing jobs going to them in the future, but simply because modern manufacturing facilities don't create so many jobs anyway. So what do we do with them? But if you look at developed countries, many of us face this problem, and Brexit maybe exaggerates it or creates greater pressure for change to move away from thinking that you're going to revive these areas into, well, what can we do that's new? The problem, of course, is that politics doesn't work. The politics is that these areas voted for Brexit and wanted to see their areas revived. So you do have an interesting political and economic issue in that situation. I was reading recently about this is probably not Brexit related, about a manufacturing facility in a small town nestled in our hills that had actually been set up in 1940 or something like that, entirely because it was not in a main centre. It was set up at the time of war or preparing for war to be away from anywhere obvious. And it was making it became a Rolls-Royce facility, making parts for wings or engines, and now is moving to Singapore. Well, nobody else is going to put such a high-value manufacturing facility in a small town that has no good connectivity or infrastructure. So what do we do with such a town? Well, this is a problem, I think, in many countries, not just the UK. Yes, I suppose if you were looking at it another way, the UK could have an advantage of trying to actually resolve this problem, but it does go against the politics. So quite awkward, but it is an awkward problem for many of us.
Thanks. Maybe just now, before I'm gonna continue with my next question, I just want to remind the audience, whenever you have a question, please just drop a line in the chat of the session, and then I'm gonna include this question into our discussion. And now what I want to do, I want to move a little bit more on current trade policy, and then maybe on to future trade policy perspective. with respect to the current one, I have been a bit surprised personally that beside all the issues with COVID-19 this year, and besides negotiating the trade agreement with the EU, the UK government seems to be successful in agreeing on trade agreements with important ally economies in a very short time, right? So Japan, Mexico, Canada, Switzerland, just to mention a few. What is your position on this? Are these good trade agreements, or are these just copy-paste agreements from the European Union? What is your assessment of these trade agreements?
It is mostly what I would call continuity minus. So they are mostly the same. Japan is slightly different. I'll come back to that. So they're mostly the same. Some are significantly worse. So agreements with European countries are worse because inevitably you can't have the same relationship you had with Switzerland or Norway or Turkey because of their relationship with the EU. So these agreements are worse for the UK. And more barriers. And if you look at UK trade figures, these are significant trade partners. So in total, our trade is, I think, 47% with the EU. If you add on those countries as well, it comes to 52 or 53%. So these are 5-6% of UK trade is with that. Now, if we look at other global, the other agreements, what we did successfully, because in the end we had 3.5 years for this. 4.5 years in the end to do this. We did manage to successfully replicate most of the EU agreements. In the case of South Korea, Mexico, Canada, we had to commit to a renegotiation of these. So that will have to start. So not perfect, but at least we have a standstill provision. In the case of the others, mostly which were smaller countries, then most of them have been agreed. A few have not been agreed. So there's a good job, but nothing more than a standstill and a little bit less. What the UK really wants is to show it can do new trade deals with the likes of the US, Australia, New Zealand, and has been busily negotiating, but those have gone slower. They had hoped to have at least one of those agreements ready more or less now as well, but that hasn't happened. That was a little bit over optimistic. So that work then therefore has to carry on, because really we need to negotiate further with Turkey, Mexico, Canada, South Korea, possibly Norway, the new agreements with Australia, New Zealand, the US, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So there's a big trade agreement agenda, but without a significant identification of UK offensive interests. And I think that is one thing that might change from what we're seeing now. But at the time that the government's negotiating objectives were published, they were mostly about tariff reduction, and it didn't identify regulation or food standards as being important issues. Maybe they will now. Japan was the exception. We managed to get a little bit more from Japan, but not significantly more. There were some minor additions in terms of services movement of people, in terms of data flows, but quite minor, and also some losses, as you would possibly expect, in terms of agricultural exports, both to Japan and to Canada. So lots of agreements, but no great upgrades on what was there already.
Okay, thanks. I think, well, we have not talked about where we are, so let's think a little bit about the future. Obviously, the biggest prize that seems to be left in terms of trade policy agreements for both the European Union and the United Kingdom is the US market, right? And so the question here would be, what is your feeling about who would be more successful in talking to the US with the new government? And there is also a question from the chat which asks whether you think that UK, US, and EU will cooperate against China in the future. Because the problems with China and US will remain, that's obvious, right? So I think that will not change too much, maybe in tone and in the way they do policy, but But
Yeah.
the competition for market number one in the world is still open, right? And so US will be more aggressive on China.
I think that the EU and US will try to do business and come up with a common position on China. But I think the divisions between the EU and the US in areas like food standards and data will, and digital taxes indeed as at the moment, will preclude detailed collaboration. I think that the commercial interests in both the EU and the US don't want to collaborate over China. They want to compete on the areas like food. So I'm quite pessimistic, I'm afraid. And I think that the UK stands a better chance of being doing a deal with the US. I don't think it's going to be worth very much, but it stands a better chance by essentially saying to the US, we can do what you want to the US. Because the problem with the EU and the US dealing with each other, well, it has been shown very well by the China investment agreement. And the US more or less saying, why didn't you wait to talk to us about it? Well, the problem is that the EU doesn't want to have to wait to get American permission, because the Americans wouldn't wait to get EU permission for their deals. You have a problematic situation with regard to China. So whilst I think there will be some surface level collaboration on China between the EU, the US and the UK, I think that it will be it will be less effective, because it will only be a fairly surface level. And I think that the EU and the US's divisions will be stronger than what they agree on with regard to China. That's not, I mean, this is speculative, and I hope that the EU and the US can find ways. Some friends who are US trade commentators have started talking in terms of whether you can get a truce between the EU and the US. And this is the kind of thing we have to look at different approaches to EU-US trade to break the problems that have been there for a long time. I'm just not sure I see it when both the EU and the US also want to bring back jobs, to reshoring of jobs, and to focus more on enforcement. So if both the EU and the US are focusing more on enforcement, in theory, that's the same thing, but in practice, that doesn't suggest that either will want to go back on fixed positions that have caused problems with the other.
Yeah, I would agree on competing interests between the European Union and the US with respect to China. I would also say that the deal on the investment agreement between the European Union and China, which came basically just in parallel to concluding the Brexit negotiation and after the election in the United States, points somehow into this direction, that there are different interests, and that the European Union wanted to be fast on this before the new administration is in there. So I don't know how that would evolve over time.
Well, China was willing to do the deal at that particular moment because it knew that there was about to be a change of administration in the US. Well, the US had already done deals, so I think that's. But there is some goodwill, so let's see if the EU and the US can do business together.
Yeah. Well, I think we have one question where Martin Groys wants to directly ask the question. Is that correct? Let's see if that works.
Coming, I think.
Yep. He's still muted. No technical problem. So maybe you just want to write your question into the chat, Martin, and then I'll take this one. We now already talked about China and US a little bit. Maybe let's go a little bit more in the future. So in Europe, there is there's always this kind of idea that the UK will come back at some point. I know we're just divorced 2 weeks ago, basically, but what is your view on on future chances that the United Kingdom, or to put it differently, some parts of it, like Scotland, will come back, and what would be the impact if Scotland would come back, so would become independent, would come back for the remainder of the kingdom?
I see two scenarios. So I think that either Scotland and Northern Ireland will be part of the EU, and England and Wales will keep the same relationship, or if we remain as the UK, that the whole of the UK will have a closer relationship than now, short of full membership. So I think that will if we stay as a United Kingdom, then I think that we can't stay with such a distant relationship. I just don't think that it's economically or politically sustainable. There will just be too many barriers. The very things that caused us in the past to seek membership will cause us to seek a closer relationship. What kind of closer relationship? Well, that I don't think that, neither Switzerland nor Norway quite works, but it has to be something that takes elements of Switzerland and Norway. I've never been a great believer in the kind of the circles model. That's sometimes the French idea of the outer circle of European countries. But I do think that we will need to think about a model that works better for the UK. I think it will evolve over 5-10 years to a point where, yes, the UK can be part of the European regulatory bodies, can have fewer barriers to trade. So something that looks a little bit more like Norway, but which also provides some level of regulatory autonomy. I think that can be devised over time, but it won't be easy to do. And for the moment, the UK doesn't have great relations with Switzerland and Norway either. I was involved in those discussions back in 2016 and 17. And at the moment, the UK is looking beyond Europe, is looking globally. And I think that the UK what is going to probably have to happen is the UK will have to do the deals with non-European countries, discover that economically this doesn't really help very much, and then kind of come back to, okay, so now what are we going to do about Europe? So I think that is a shift that will take quite a few years. We'll get the US deal perhaps in 3 years' time, and then in 6-7 years we'll realize that economically it's still not the answer. We need more with Europe, and then I think we come back to finding what we do with Europe. So what will the EU prefer, and how will the EU see things, given it didn't like the Switzerland? Well, I think here the EU is going to have to be flexible at some point. I think that the EU doesn't really have a vision insofar as where the UK fits, and it's been easy enough to just hold the line and say no special treatment. But everybody gets special treatment in their own ways. So I think that the EU has to think about how the UK gets a particular place that works for both. It will take time to work that out. And I don't think the agreement as a whole is settled at all. I think that, so I'm sort of sweeping up a few things that people have said here.
Yeah, that's great.
And I think that the agreement is not settled. I think I would treat this as the first stage of an agreement. I don't think it'll be quick to negotiate. I'm not one of those who thinks that we can instantly change the agreement or find new things. But I think that, again, over time, elements will be added to the agreement, or new agreements, whether on mutual recognition. We already know equivalence will be added or not. So there will be elements to come, but it won't be easy, and that the negotiations will be tough for those. So I think both the UK most obviously, we can see what the future path of the UK in terms of interest in Europe will be. I think a little more easily than we can see what the EU path will be. What will the EU want from the UK? And I guess I often say that I think that the EU has not quite got over the UK leaving yet. That it was a shock. And there are a number of people in the EU who would like to see the UK fail. We don't say that, but plenty of people do. So it will take time for the EU to realise this was a shock. We now have relatively strong country outside of the EU who are going to do their own thing. How are we going to coexist?
Yeah, I would also see this it's very similar to your arguments. I would guess that we need to learn the functioning of this agreement over time. And if changes are beneficial to both sides, then they will be rather easy to carry out. But obviously, the difficult issues that made the negotiations difficult will remain difficult. And we need to see whether we can have any progress on this over time. It would be helpful, of course, to have progress. So just picking up the last questions here is again coming back to service. So what is your assessment of the quality of the deal with respect to services? And as you already have said a little bit, so you would also, I think you would also guess that we would move on negotiating on changes in services as well.
Yeah, I think in services that no free trade agreement really does very well with services. I think we have the modes of supply which don't really talk to how we provide services nowadays anyway. So what is at the heart of the provision of services in modern trade relations? What is this all about? A lot of it clearly is about data. A lot of it is about people being able to go somewhere to provide a service, but a lot of it is just the direct sales and what the regulations are. It's normally complex. It's fragmented as the provision of services, and quite a lot in areas like consultancy or ICT. A lot of services trade is just almost film production. It ignores trade rules anyway and just kind of carries on. So I think we need to do a lot more anyway to think about services. And I think if the UK was going to think more deeply about our trade policy, the place I would start would be on services, to say, what can the UK government do differently? What approach could we do differently on services? And could we get support from others to do? And then maybe take that back to the EU. So I think the UK has been a little bit passive in terms of our thinking. And so that, given we are so strong in services, this is an area we should develop. But I'm not so confident we will. But I think that in general, services elements of trade agreements aren't great. I think we need to develop them much further. Yeah,
very interesting, but I would agree, and this is also what our evidence from the new study shows, is that trade deals are not doing good with respect to services trade. So there is not a lot of gains here from previous agreements with respect to services trade. So, but then the question would be, do we have a kind of comprehensive trade agreement with respect to services? And then I can argue, yes, we have the single market.
Well, we have the single market.
And here comes the issue, right? Because if you want to do more in services, then you need to talk about a single market and the four freedoms, essentially, right? You need to have people being allowed to move where they want to move in order to provide their services. And this is obviously what, at least for the moment, the United Kingdom is not willing to do.
Well, look, there is an element of people moving to provide services, but then the full-time relocation of individuals to provide services is only a small part of the services trade. Given the wildly differing figures we have between the US, the UK, and the EU on services trade, we need to know what it is. Yeah. But I think an awful lot of it is, a lot of it can now be provided remotely, and probably is provided remotely. Yes, people moving is an issue. Yes, clearly the ownership of the data is an issue. There is the services element of manufacturing, the so-called Mode 5. There are many things here. I haven't fully, I've got a paper to write about this in a month or two's time, but I haven't fully got my head around where services trade is going to. But then we need to find another way to think about services trade in free trade agreements. And I don't have the answers to that yet, but it's something the UK government might like to look at, and something that I think we can, I think we can find a middle ground between a free trade agreement and a single market.
Sure, hopefully. We are already a little bit over time, but I think there is at least one interesting question which I want to pose. We haven't talked about direct investment we just have talked about it very briefly when you said, well, especially in the financial services industry, it might be that FDI will be used by UK providers in order to have branches within the European Union in order to provide services there. What would be your expectation with respect to changes in bilateral FDI?
Yeah, it's not really my subject. Not something I've studied closely. I mean, at the moment, you're still getting a lot of FDI inflow to the UK specifically in technology, financial technology.
Yeah.
In fact, the areas the UK is strong competitively in are areas that attract a lot of FDI. So where we probably won't get much FDI, to be honest, is in new manufacturing plants or gigafactories, the battery factories. But I can imagine we still get plenty in research and development, in science, pharmaceuticals, financial services, ICT, where we're strong. So. Yeah, I don't know what that adds up to. It has been falling in manufacturing. Again, a lot comes back to how the UK economy develops, that tension between what we're good at, services, but what people want to see, manufacturing. I would, if we focused on our strengths, if we go into do a lot more in services, I think, we could see that we would still get there would still be a fair amount of FDI between the two parties, but I'm afraid I'm not being an expert, and that I can't really say much more than that.
Thank you very much, David. I think we are now out of time. I want to thank you very, very much for being with us today, for all your insights, also for bringing in the perspective of UK a little bit more for our understanding here in continental Europe. I also learned that, of course, with 2 weeks, just the trade agreement being in force, we don't really know yet what the effects of this will be. So I think we will need to redo this discussion in a couple of months or years to come. So I would be delighted and very happy if we could come back to Brexit and the consequences over the course of time and have you around, hopefully also physically then, to discuss this issue further. With this, I also want to thank the audience for being with us today. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. I learned a lot. Myself, I hope, or it would be great if you can also take something away from this first FIW Trade Talk. And we're gonna move on with future topics very soon. Will be announced as usual over our email distribution and so on and so forth, and on our blog and via Twitter, social media, everything. With this, I want to conclude. Thank you, everybody. Thanks especially David Henig for being with us today. It had been great fun for me, and I wish you all a great evening and take care and stay healthy, everybody.